For this speech, I first thought I was going to tell you about what is wrong with our world. I wanted to tell you about how there are more African Americans under correctional control in jail, prison, or probation currently than were ever held as slaves prior to the Civil War in the United States. I wanted to tell you about how, as of 2004, more African American men were disenfranchised and didn't have the right to vote than in the year 1870. That's the year the 15th Amendment was passed and ratified. And that 15th Amendment prohibited laws that explicitly denied the right to vote on the basis of color. I wanted to tell you about the fact that a black child born today is less likely to be raised by both parents than a black child born during slavery. A main cause of this disintegration of the African American family is due in large part to the mass imprisonment of black fathers. I wanted to tell you about the fact that the New York Times reports that we have less than 5% of the world's population, but over 25% of the world's prisoners. That equates to a number of over 2.3 million prisoners in the United States. I wanted to tell you that if you break that number down and account for adults in the American population, it tells us that 1 in every 100 adults in this country is in prison.
Wow.
I wanted to tell you that this America has more prisoners than communist China, a nation of over 1 billion people. I wanted to tell you about how when each one of those 2.3 million prisoners get out of prison, they are disenfranchised, often permanently. In Florida, for instance, your rights are taken away once you're convicted. And they say you can get them restored. But for less violent crimes, ex-prisoners have to wait 5 years to attempt to restore their rights. A process which requires them to be investigated, a process that currently has a 6-year waiting period. A process which in Florida last year only processed 175 applications for rights restoration, in which out of that number 100 were recommended to have their rights restored. And that process resulted in restoring the rights of only 2. I wanted to tell you about how these ex-prisoners are part of a growing undercaste, not class, caste, a group of people who are permanently relegated by law to an inferior second-class status, who are denied the right to vote, automatically excluded from juries, and legally discriminated against employment, housing, access to education, and public benefits, much as their grandparents and great-grandparents were once during the Jim Crow era. I wanted to tell you about how the fact that once a person is disenfranchised and can't find a job or a house, they are likely to turn back to crime, because it pays, unlike the jobs that they can't find and can't be hired for. I wanted to tell you about how that gives them a one-way ticket back to prison, and with laws like 3 strikes ensures that the third time they will be in jail for life. In fact, just this week, a man was sentenced to life in prison for witnessing a drug deal. Not taking part in it, just watching it happen. Life in prison. I wanted to tell you about how this trend will only increase as we allow more and more for-profit prisons to open up. Take, for instance, Louisiana. Take, for instance, Louisiana, which houses a majority of its inmates in for-profit prisons. Since they have moved to mainly for-profit prisons, their state's incarceration rates have skyrocketed. It is triple Iran's incarceration rate and 10 times China's incarceration rate. I wanted to tell you about how in Louisiana, 1 in 14 black men is in prison, and 1 in 7 is under correctional control. I wanted to tell you about how these prisons make money by having more and more prisoners brought in. Each prisoner in there means more money for the prisoner owners. So naturally, driven by profit, they find ways to keep prisoners in for longer sentences, and they find ways to get them to return to prison. They also contract prison labor out, paying prisoners pennies while the owners of the prisons reap huge profits themselves. There is a name for this practice. It's called slavery.
That's right.
I wanted to tell you about how the privatization of prisons is growing across this country at an alarming rate, thanks to a wealthy and powerful group of prison lobbyists who influence everything from prison sentencing laws to tax breaks for private prisons. I wanted to tell you about how mass incarceration and disenfranchisement is akin to slavery and Jim Crow laws, albeit appearing with a different face this time than it did in the past. I wanted to tell you about how now having a permanent prison class destroys families, weakening the most important group a society has to depend on, which in turn disempowers the entire community. I wanted to tell you about how minority communities have almost 80% of the toxic waste sites
pollution sites and landfills next to their neighborhoods, and how the EPA has provided over 80 studies that have consistently shown that minorities and low-income communities are disproportionately exposed to environmental harms and risks, putting them at their risk for far higher levels of cancer and other terminal diseases. I wanted to tell you about how banks and mortgage companies funnel minorities into risky subprime loans, even if they're eligible for more stable loans.
That's right.
I wanted to tell you about the fact that there have been over 8 million foreclosures since 2006, 3.4 million which have been completed, leaving a large swath of our population homeless and with ruined credit. I wanted to tell you about how 46.2 million people in 2011 lived below the poverty line, and that number is increasing every year. I wanted to tell you about how the government has done nothing to ameliorate these despite American situations, while the government has given the very people, the banks and corporations who got us into this economic mess by their greed, trillions of dollars at no cost. And I wanted to tell you how not a single criminal charge has been brought against a single one of those banks or CEOs for their criminal acts. I wanted to tell you about how on almost a daily basis I receive a phone call about someone about a cop beating them up. And that someone 99% of the time is black and poor and has committed no crime. I wanted to tell you about how the drug war unfairly targets minorities. I wanted to tell you about how everyone has been silenced from talking about race in this country because racism is supposedly in the past. I wanted to tell you about how racism is much more dangerous now because it is socially frowned upon to talk about race and racist policies in this country. I wanted to tell you about the fact that this silence about race only makes it worse. I wanted to tell you about how you have every right not to trust me because I am white. I wanted to tell you about the fact that studying and practicing civil rights law is depressing because the history of the law in this country over the past 30 years has been a history of more and more rights being taken away and a history of obstacles being created for a person to vindicate what rights do remain. I wanted to tell you about how your president, who promised you change, has instead made it a law that he can indefinitely detain American citizens without charge, trial, or jury. I wanted to tell you about how our police, members of our communities, violently repress and brutalize peaceful, nonviolent citizens who would dare to make their voices heard. I wanted to tell you about how 5.4 million people have been murdered in the Congo in the past 10 years, and most Americans don't even know about it. I wanted to tell you about how the IMF and World Bank manipulate countries across the world to make them economic slaves to multinational corporations. I wanted to tell you about how systematically we have been shut out of the political process in this country, which now serves nothing but those with the most money, corporations. I wanted to tell you about how those with the most money ensure that more private prisons are built, that environmental regulations are not enforced, that minimum wage is not lifted, that the cost of an education continues to rise, that the banks get bailouts, that make sure average people don't get help. And why does this happen? So they can make money at your expense. I was going to tell you about how we continue to atrophy jobs in this country because we reward corporations who send jobs overseas and because we have allowed speculation on Wall Street, which is nothing more than a glorified casino, to account for over 75% of our economy. I wanted to tell you about how those bankers on Wall Street and other large corporations control every policy in this country, which is why our shining hope, Barack Obama, has not made a difference and us have utterly failed to bring the change he promised. I wanted to tell you about how the next generation will have to deal with a lower quality of life and more problems because we are too distracted or unwilling to face reality to make the tough choices to actually fight back and change the tide. I was going to tell you about those things, and then I remembered a quote from Thoreau, who said, "For every 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil, there is one striking at the root." You see, everything I was going to tell you about is true and a damning indictment of our society. Each one of us here could just take one of those issues and work our entire lives trying to solve that specific problem. But the fact is, we probably would not solve that problem, and even if we did, another branch of that tree of evil would grow up in its place. There is a larger problem. I witnessed it recently. That problem is people don't care enough to make their values a reality. Earlier this year, the Trayvon Martin tragedy occurred. Though sad, I had hoped it would be a crystallizing moment that could ignite a new movement, because that tragedy for a moment had pulled back the veil and exposed the racist underbelly of our society for all to see. As long as it was in the news for a week, people cared. Even Movement for Change had a rally. I was there. There were hundreds of people, angry, indignant, and righteously so. The feeling in the air was palpable. This would be the moment. But alas, it was as the poet Robinson Jeffers pointed out in his poem Shy and Perishing Republic, that protest is only a bubble in the molten mass. It pops, sighs out, and the mass hardens. And sure enough, no sooner than that mass had bubbled up, it receded and hardened back into its place. There were no more marches, no more speeches given, no more people in the streets, no boycotts. In fact, as soon as it left the television screen, it was all over. This has been the sad history of my lifetime. The sad repetition of this history. People get incensed, they get angry, and as soon as they appear, they disappear back to their lives. This point brings us to not one of the branches of evil, but to the very root. The problem, the real problem that exists in this country is me. What's wrong with this world is me. I am the problem. You are the problem. We are the problem. Why are we the problem, and not the people who have wholly corrupted our political system? The lobbyists, the bankers, the private prison owners, the politicians. Why are we the problem and not those who allow racist policies and laws to exist? They are the evil ones, right? Not us. No, it is me and it is you who are the problem. The very people who are good are the problem. Because even if you and I do something, it's not enough. It's not enough because despite our best efforts to make change in the world around us, we are still avoiding the real problem. The reason we are deathly afraid to face that problem is because that problem is looking back at us in the bathroom mirror every morning. That real problem is ourselves. That real problem is my core values, your core values, and the values of our society. The reason all the mounting problems I was going to talk to you about exist is because we allow them to exist. And as Martin Luther King Jr. once said, he who passively accepts evil is as much involved in it as he who helps to perpetrate it. He who accepts evil without protesting against it is really cooperating with it. You see, our values, yours and mine, are misplaced. The hardest thing in the world to face, to accept, is the fact that maybe we have gotten our fundamental values fundamentally wrong. These fundamental values, after all, are what constitute our characters, guide our actions, are the point from which we move inward to outward in the world. They are what define us. And what is a word without a definition? To question those core values is to have to examine ourselves under a microscope with every potential for discovering that we have been wrong all along. That in fact, we are a word without a definition, a character without traits, or worse, that we are filled with noxious values that are poisoning our lives, our minds, our spirits, and the lives of those around us, in our communities, in our states, in our nations, in our world. But unless we each, individually and as a society, begin the terrifying journey of being honest with ourselves and begin examining our values, those problems I was going to talk to you about will only multiply exponentially, will only exacerbate, will lead us off a cliff from which there will be no return. So begin this difficult journey, we must. This brings us to the question of what are our values and where do we get them from? As we each must take our own personal journey to find out what our own personal values are, and because naturally we are the only persons who can cause ourselves to change those values. That journey is left to each one of you to take individually and explore. But what you and I can discuss is our society's highest values. To do this, it is important to not listen to what we say our values are, like politicians like to do, but to look at our society's actions instead. As the old adage is true, actions speak louder than words. It is the actions our society takes and their effects which express what our values really are. All those problems I was going to talk to you about represent our values. We are a society that above all values money and the selfish pursuit of individual wealth and success. Our heroes truly are not the Martin Luther Kings of the world, are not the Cornel Wests of the world, are not the Noam Chomskys, Howard Zinns, nor Rosa Parks of the world, but rather our heroes are billionaire bankers, corporate CEOs, celebrities whose only claim to fame is that they have money. We value their selfishness, their material wealth, and their accumulation of things. So a question comes to mind. What is the actual value of a dollar? Well, a dollar is just a piece of paper. It has no intrinsic value. So, the value of a dollar is nothing. And the logical question which follows that is, what are the values of society that values a dollar above all else? The answer, we are a society that values nothing. What a dangerous place to live. Because if our actions indicate that we value nothing, then it's okay that our society is racist. It's okay that our society is misogynistic. It's okay that we start wars for no reason. It's okay that there are more blacks in prison than were slaves in America prior to the Civil War. It's okay that BP spills oil into our backyard and does nothing about it. It's okay to sell loans to people who can't afford them, then kick them out of their homes and blame it on them. A society which values nothing is a society that I want no part in. A society that is so selfish and individualistic is a society that can walk past these problems on a daily basis and do nothing about them. Why? Why can we walk past these problems? We can walk past these problems because they're not happening to me. Because it's not my fault that you're getting sent to war. You signed up for the military. It's not my fault that you were homeless or poor because you just worked hard enough. You wouldn't be. It's not my fault your home was foreclosed on. You should not have been so stupid enough to take out that loan. It's not my fault because I'm only responsible for myself, me, the individual, and my goals and my success are all that matter to me. This is the story we've been told our entire lives in this country. This is our master narrative, and narrative controls everything. The stories we tell each other control everything. And our current narrative, the me narrative, the rugged individualist narrative, has become the religion of this country. And look at the countless problems it has caused, continues to cause, and will into the future. That is, until we start telling a new story. But to do this, we will first have to rid ourselves of our addiction to the story we've all come to know as the truth. The story that tells us things are just the way they are. The story that tells us things will always be this way. Like an addict, this will be a difficult process. We will have to first to identify what triggers our addiction to this story. Things like television, movies, music video, advertisements, the evening news, politicians, all which are selling us this poisonous story, this propaganda, and reinforcing its lies. In fact, these are the major forces which we allow to define reality for us. After all, reality is defined and created through our experiences. If our experiences are watching movies, television, advertisements, music, and they are telling us the same stories, then that story becomes our reality. We internalize its values, and we begin to believe that those values are the essential values which make up human experience. Those values are the truth. And we are addicted to this story. If we were only made aware of how this story is mistaken, then maybe it will be easier to begin telling a new one. One of the great stories we are told that reinforces our value of the me narrative is the story of natural selection. We are told that the world is all about competition, where it is about survival of the fittest. So we human beings need only worry about ourselves and compete like hell to try and reach the top. I recently learned some interesting things about Darwin's theory. You see, it turns out that Darwin, in his famous book, only mentioned survival of the fittest twice. That's it. 2 measly times. Did he ever mention any other word more than this? It turns out he did. That word was love. How many times did he mention it? 95 times. That's right, 95 times. On top of that, Darwin did a pretty thorough analysis of human behavior that's usually overlooked. And what he found was that the strongest trait that human beings exhibited most often was compassion, sympathy. He found that we were not the strongest species that there were animals that were much more ferocious, larger, and dangerous human beings, and that our reason for success was our uncanny ability to cooperate. And as a result of that cooperation, human beings became the most successful species on this planet. So, to enable us to cooperate, we developed complex emotions and an ability to be sympathetic and empathetic with one another. We also developed complex nerve endings on our body that are very sensitive to touch, on our arms and necks. We also developed complex physiological emotional centers. One special place is called the vagus nerve. While you may not know the name, you know the feeling it causes in you. When it is activated, the vagus nerve gives you that hair-raising feeling on your arms, that lightness in the chest, and that water welling up in your eyes. When you see something touching, like a child being rescued from the rubble in Japan 4 days after the earthquake and tsunami, or when you see a long-lost relative for the first time in years, or when you hear the story about an American tank commander in World War II who liberated Holocaust survivors from the German trains moving them to another concentration camp, and who 50 years later is found by one of the very people he saved from that train, a person who spent his lifetime looking for that specific tank commander, just to thank him for saving him. Why would we need these nerves, these emotional responses? We need these because by being sensitive to emotion and sensitive to touch, we grow stronger bonds with other people. And as we grow stronger bonds, we cooperate more. So you see, the story that we have been told is a lie. Our value in competition over cooperation is a lie. The value of rugged individualism over community values and cooperation is a lie. Lies which have been reinforced by the media, politicians, movies, music, and a lie which we ourselves have reinforced. The secret, it turns out, is no secret at all. It's something our bodies have been hardwired to do. That secret is that our true highest value is compassion and cooperation. This is the story that needs to be told. The story of how we human beings thrive when we care for one another and cooperate to ensure our mutual success. This is the story that must be told to change our values as a society and to deal with the seemingly insurmountable problems we currently face. Only together, through hard work, can we hope to achieve anything meaningful. And our efforts must be consistent. We cannot let the apathy that causes our protests to pop and sigh out and harden into nothing, like occurred with the Trayvon Martin tragedy. And we must be willing to be uncomfortable as we learn to reconnect with other human beings we have distanced ourselves from. And we must be willing to motivate and support each other to keep going, because the road ahead, I can damn well assure you, is not easy. We cannot expect others to do this work for us either. We cannot say, hey, that's messed up. Somebody should do something about that. You are that somebody. You must take chances and risks. You cannot defeat yourself before you begin. You cannot live in fear. You cannot say, well, I could lose my job for speaking up, and then my mortgage if I lose my job. Because while your family security is fundamental, the short term, the long-term security for them is getting worse every moment you do not act. You cannot say, I work too much to find the time to do something about this. You cannot say, I am too tired from working hard. You cannot say, I am afraid to go to jail. You must find the time. You must take the risks. You simply must. Because your futures, your children's futures, and their children's futures depend on this critical period of history that you and I, for better or worse, currently find ourselves situated in. You, me, we must all take action to change the core values of ourselves and our society. As each moment we don't, we are working for those very values that are tearing this country and our society apart. Each moment I don't take a step, I am part of the problem. Each moment you don't take a step, you are part of the problem. And do not think that each step you have to take has to be a leap. As Howard Zinn said, history is all about little people taking little steps. When there are lots of us taking little steps together, a noise builds up. A noise that builds into a thundering roar with each step we take together. A roar that builds up until one day a consciousness arises that is so powerful that the world must change. And little places can make big changes. In 1955, there was a small town in Alabama that most of the United States, let alone the world, had ever heard of. In that town was a regular woman with a regular job who was just trying to make ends meet. But she realized one day that her values meant nothing without action. So one day after work, she got on a bus and she sat down in a seat. The problem was, according to the law, she was black and was not allowed to sit in that seat. She was asked to move. She was told to move. She politely refused. She was arrested for this one small act, sitting down. She was arrested because her values of justice and equality meant nothing if she did not act. You know her name. You also know the name of the 26-year-old minister who had just moved to that town after having received his doctorate of theology from Boston University. He came to her aid because he knew that values were meaningless without action. He knew, as he once said, that the hottest place in hell is reserved for those who remain neutral in times of great moral conflict. So he acted. He spoke to his community members and asked them to sacrifice their use of the city buses. He asked them to make their lives more difficult by working together as a community to refuse to succumb any longer to injustice. And the people in that small town in the middle of Alabama that nobody knew about did. They sacrificed. They worked together to carpool each other to and from work, to carpool and arrange transportation to get to work and home from work and to the grocery store and back. And each step they took was just a little step, a little one. But they took these steps together, and the movement built. And the world came to know the name of that small town in Alabama, Montgomery. And out of Montgomery, a town much like Pensacola, a movement was born for social justice that reshaped this country. Why? Because they realized that instead of waiting for somebody to do something about that, they realized that they were that somebody. They realized that their values were nothing without action. Before I leave tonight, I'd like to leave you with a thought which keeps me going. A thought that's from one of my favorite philosophers, Richard Rorty. He said, "You have to describe the country in terms of what you passionately hope it will become, as well as in terms of what you know it to be now. You have to be loyal to a dream country rather than the one to which you wake up every morning. Unless such loyalty exists, the ideal has no chance of becoming actual." Thank you.